I appreciate the opportunity to come back to Alaska. I always enjoy coming up here because this is one of the areas where I work. In the south, we have lots of water, not necessarily good quality water, but we have very few salmon. And what few salmon we do have generally come from hatcheries. So even though things may look a little tough in this immediate area, relatively speaking, you have what salmon biologists like, and that's actually fish. We spend probably 100 times more money than you do on salmon restoration and management, but still you have fish. Okay, let's talk about what I'm going to talk about today, and that's three things. Okay, so a lot of this is review for a lot of you. No real surprises here. It's not supposed to be particularly complicated or challenging in terms of difficult information. The first thing I'm going to talk about is bring us back to square one, which is let's talk about a brief history of salmon worldwide. The world didn't revolve around salmon issues in this area or this northwestern U.S. or eastern North America or elsewhere. I mean, lots of things have happened other places, and there should be some lessons learned that we can glean from those areas. So I'll talk for about 10 to 12 minutes about that. I'm going to talk about probably the most important lessons you can learn here, and that is what happened in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm going to talk about what is most likely status in the Pacific Northwest through 2100. Now, I know some of you out there, at least a few, are actually Canadians. So for Canadians, I apologize. This is really the Pacific Southwest that we're going to talk about. Depends on your perspective. So what I'm generally going to talk about is California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and southern British Columbia. That will be defined, generally speaking, as the Pacific Northwest. News to the Californians, but that's the way it is. They have so few salmon, they really don't count anymore. All right. And finally, the most relevant part, I think, is what are the alternatives? This isn't rocket science here, to use the old cliche. A lot of these issues aren't that complicated. They're difficult. They're nasty choices. They're unpleasant choices. People would rather not make them, or they'd rather not make them explicitly. But it's not that difficult. Okay, a few points of reference, and these are important points before I get into the substance of what I want to talk about. The first one. No one has been out to eradicate salmon. Now, some of my career with EPA, I worked on issues like, wolves and cougars and grizzlies and stuff. And, there are people who want to get rid of them. And in the lower 48, in a lot of places, if you say, we're going to bring back wolves, people are going to come in and go after you. They don't want them back. We eradicated them once, and we don't want them back. Cougars, no one likes cougars anymore because they're hanging around towns and eating people's pets. And, you can do lots of things. You can do something with your livestock, you take one or two of your kids, you take somebody's dog, and that is it for cougars. And the same with grizzlies. Grizzlies are great in a remote site, but when they eat one or two campers, that causes real problems for the agencies. Secondly it is very easy for me or many of you to get lost in the technical weeds. We can talk about the life history of saying what kind of gravel I need, what about this or that, or how much water, when. These are, generally speaking, important, but technical weeds. I'm going to try to avoid that. And I also want to be very careful not to step into the alternate parallel universes that we oftentimes sink into by starting off by saying assume a perfect world. All the choices are easy. Everybody is above average. No one's a loser in policy choices. This is delusional reality. It doesn't exist, and I'm going to try to avoid that. I'm also going to knock it into doom and gloom. We have plenty of salmon worldwide. Arguably, we have more salmon alive today than we've ever had in history. Ever had in history. Now, most of those are in net pens and so forth, and what's not in net pens oftentimes are produced in hatcheries. But we have a lot of salmon worldwide. There is no likelihood that essentially any species of salmon is going to go extinct in the foreseeable future. Now, sure, individual stocks, individual runs, and maybe even the whole lower 48 can go extinct. But there's no likelihood we're going to lose sockeye populations or Chinook populations or anything else worldwide in the foreseeable future. Now, that's not necessarily good or bad. It's just a fact. And I'm not here to cheerlead for a particular policy. I'm not going to come in with a policy and say you ought to do this or you should do this. I'm just going to give you some policy options, and those people who make policy choices can pick and choose among these or some others. Let's talk about the decline worldwide. Start with square one. We oftentimes think of history as what happened when I was a kid. That was the perfect world, and now things have gone down the tubes. Let's go back a few more years. Salmon distribution is not fixed. It changes over time. If you go back 20,000 years, the ice was very far south. Salmon were compressed in a very small area, and as the ice fields retreated back north with warming climate, salmon expanded. The forest expanded, the soils developed, and salmon assumed a broader distribution. This happened before in different ice ages, and it happened at the end of the last one. If you go back 10,000 years, the ice cover had receded to approximately where it is now, and salmon were, relatively speaking, as over centuries, expanding northward in their distribution, and they were expanding inward. In our cases, they were moving north out of what is now the lower 48, moving into BC, Yukon, Alaska, and they did the same thing on the Asian side of the Pacific. That was about 10,000 years ago. If you go back 4,000 years ago, the salmon distribution was approximately what it is now. And let's review that distribution, what it is now and what it was 4,000 years ago. Now the numbers are different, but the distribution is the same. We're not the only game in town. Let's start with Asia. The distribution of salmon historically, 4,000 years onward, started as far south as about what is now Taiwan, mid-China, through Korea, Japan, what is now the Russian Far East, very large runs of salmon, and they went as far north as around the Arctic Ocean. If you start in Europe, the runs, these were Atlantic salmon and sea-run brown trout, obviously very similar species to what we have. They went as far south as southern Spain, maybe even relatively cool times even into northern Africa, but certainly went down as far as south and southern part of Spain, north through what is now the EU, up Norway, around Finland, over the backside into some of the Russian Arctic rivers of Russia. Eastern North America, as far south as the Connecticut River. Atlantic salmon is basically the only species out there that's anadromous, and a salmon species that's anadromous. As far south as Connecticut River, up through northeast, around the Maritimes, a little bit around into the Arctic Oceans. And of course, in our part of the world, the runs that went as far south, maybe even on occasion a few centuries into northern Mexico, but certainly down to San Diego. In very cool times, very wet times, very ideal times, they can get that far south. And over centuries, they can contract or expand. And as far as north as we all know about. Now let's look in 2012. Now, Asia, same species we have, they are still in China. Very remnant runs, certainly not fishable. They're gone essentially in China. Practically speaking, a few remnant runs in Korea, but they're largely gone. Taiwan, I think they're almost entirely gone, maybe a few residual runs, one or two species we don't have here. Japan still has big runs, virtually entirely supported by hatchery operations, but the Russian Far East has lots of salmon, very similar to here. Go to Europe. The runs are, we still have salmon runs in Spain. People still fish for salmon in Spain, but they're remnant runs, trophy runs, very, very few. It's essentially gone from Spain, Portugal, Germany, France, UK, especially the southern part, really has no appreciation. There's always remnant runs, a few stragglers here and there, but Scotland's got a few runs, and a few other places have runs. Around Norway, reduced runs, but still good runs. Finland, and even into Russia, still reasonably good runs. Reduced, but reasonably good. The Maritimes, or the US, gone from the US, essentially, they're gone. Maritimes reduced, but still have runs. Atlantic salmon primarily. Okay, that's that. Let's talk about here. Here being Western North America. What's happening in here, what has happened, and what's going to happen. Let's start with the modern era of salmon in Western North America, up and down the coast. And that starts with the gold rush. This is the beginning of modern times, the last 163 years or how long that is. In 1848, had you come to California for gold, you would have done what? You would have fished and you would have wiped out the runs in the Central Valley, but nonetheless, you wouldn't have done that because you're all competent fisheries people. You would have surveyed. And if you would have surveyed salmon, you would have found the following. Why waste your time on such monetary things like getting gold and getting rich? And you would have found salmon in abundance as far south as just above San Diego, including the coast of California, Central Valley of California, both San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers, drainages. The coast of California could have been very good runs up and down the coast, Oregon, Washington. You would have gone up in Idaho, you'd find salmon runs up there. And you would have found salmon runs even a little bit into Nevada, okay? If you continued on up, you would have found very good runs in British Columbia, particularly the Fraser, Yukon, Alaska, plenty of runs. But you came back in another life in 2012 and did the same survey. And what do you find in the so-called northern half of the distribution? The northern half is north of mid-British Columbia, and that's because of defined as the northern half because it tends to oscillate in terms of ocean cycles. Good times up here are usually bad times for salmon down there and vice versa over a 20 or 30 year period. So the northern half of the distribution, in spite of what you think, has great salmon runs compared to the rest of the world, okay? The southern half does not. And that's what I really want to focus on. What happened down there? Why did it happen? And what are the alternative choices that could change that future trajectory up here? Well, we all know about the causes of the decline, and there's really no surprise here. I mean, even the people at the time, it was no surprise. Start with the gold rush, 1848, 1849. The rivers of the Central Valley were altered in ways that they wiped out the salmon runs, and they never are going to recover in the foreseeable future. Placer mining, hydraulic mining, intensive fishing to absolutely put a net across the stream and catch every last salmon to support mining operations with protein and so forth, wiped out those salmon runs, and the people at the time knew it. You look at the quotes in the rivers, the newspapers of San Francisco, and they say, our salmon are disappearing, this is a bad thing, we got to do something about it. No surprise here. I mean, it wasn't ignorance, it was just a fact of life, that was a choice. People would rather eat than not eat, and so the salmon were wiped out. Heavy industrial fishing moving up the coast, very, very intensive fishing. I mean, salmon are very, very productive species, can take a very heavy fishing pressure without major problems, but there's not unlimited. And they can't easily take very targeted fishing. So very targeted fishing early on was on certain species and certain sizes. Nets are highly selective, and so you tended to hit very hard the highly desirable species, and lots of other species were considered to just not worth the effort. And a lot of land use practices, particularly in the area of logging, not the logging as much as the sluicing practice, where you didn't really have roads and so forth, and so you built up logs, harvested logs, built them up behind temporary dams, blew or released the dams quickly and ran the logs down the streams to an area where you could do something with them. The rivers along the coast of Oregon, Washington, that area look pretty pristine. If you walk through there, they look very pristine. They are not. Those rivers are generally stripped down to bedrock because of the sluicing activity. And it will take, with nothing else is done, it's going to take hundreds of years to get those rivers back to what they were previously. And that's a situation that most people don't realize. Dams. Here's an earth-shaking conclusion. Dams are not a salmon's best friends. But it's not really the main stem dams that cause the biggest problems. They're not good either from a salmon perspective. It's all the tributary dams. The Columbia Snake River has 14 main stem dams, but it has 25 so-called minor dams on the tribs. The minor dams are defined by those less than 100 feet. That's a pretty big dam. All these 2,500 tributary dams really did a number on salmon in addition to the main stems. The trib dams generally don't have fish passage. The main stems generally, most of them do. Irrigation system. Those of you who come from my part of the world, which is western Oregon, it's a wet climate. The West is not wet typically, it's dry. And if you're going to farm, you need irrigation water. So these irrigation systems, which is really what the Columbia Basin plan was initially, really did a number on salmon, and it continues to do a number on salmon. Land use. You want a road to go someplace. You want to build a house. You want to put your barn someplace. You want a school. You want a municipal building. These all have to be built someplace. And some of them are neutral, but most of them are slightly negative on salmon. Non-native species, they get a bad rap, and from a salmon perspective, it's not good. But generally speaking, the native species are doing well in the lower 48 because the habitat has changed, so it favors those species. What people often don't recognize is most of the fishing in the Northwest is not on salmon, it's on warm water species, bass, largemouth, smallmouth, walleyes, all the sunfishes. They're doing great. And they're doing great because the habitat now favors them. Not true for salmon. And hatcheries. Hatcheries are just a tool. They're not good or bad. They're like hammers. Hammers for certain things are really good. As a weapon, they're not so good. And so it really depends on what you're going to use the tool for. But the argument, as in the lower 48 has been, is that a lot of times hatcheries were used because people were convinced that you could give up the habitat and substitute a hatchery to maintain the run. Essentially, the Japanese model. You don't have habitat because you've got 100 million people in a very small island, so you can maintain runs by hatcheries. And I think actually you can maintain runs by hatcheries, but what you give up are the, quote, wild fish. Okay, let's talk about 3 types of salmon. It's a very simple point, but I think an important one. Fish that originate from hatcheries, those that are farmed, and those that are wild. Okay? Obviously, the first two came from wild fish originally. Hatchery fish are pretty clear-cut. They can either be one of 2 ways. One is basically supplemental to a wild spawning fish, and they go back way up the river, and they react in a lot of ways just like wild salmon. Farm salmon is clear-cut. That's agriculture. It's like growing chickens. No one expects chickens to compete with wild chickens out in the bush or wherever chickens came from. You grow chickens in a place and then you harvest them, you're done. Same with wild fish. Okay, and they all mostly come from Chile, Norway, Scotland, and a few from BC and so forth. But hatchery fish can also support runs, like the ocean ranching model. It's used a lot in Alaska and Japan and some other places. But wild fish drives policy in the lower 48. That's crucial. Wild fish are important, and the definition of wild fish is important because we have the Endangered Species Act. And the Endangered Species Act is an incredibly powerful tool for people who want to advocate for policy because it allows individuals to sue the government for noncompliance, and if you prevail, the government, i.e. the taxpayers, pay your legal fees. So it's become incredibly powerful, and of course from an agency perspective, it's become in some sense a nightmare because your staff gets burned up supporting these various lawsuits and so forth, and is a real issue. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying it's the reality in the lower 48. But what is a wild fish? What is a wild salmon? It's not a scientific definition. The current legal definition that's being used is those salmon produced from parents who spawn naturally in natural habitat. There's nothing that says this is a good definition or a bad definition, but it's the ones being used. Now, what constitutes a wild fish? A fish that goes out from a hatchery, goes out, lives in the ocean, comes back and spawns, is obviously not a wild fish. It may be wild caught, which is the way it's usually marketed, but it's not a wild fish. But the offspring of that, if they don't go back to the hatchery, they stray. The hatcheries just take a certain number and let the others do whatever they're going to do. They support the fishery, they reproduce. Their offspring are wild. Well, how wild is a wild fish whose parents were from a hatchery? But that's a definition of what a wild fish is. Now, one point I want to talk more specifically about is the actual numbers of the decline. But keep in mind, we all know this, that salmon are a resilient species. These are like weeds. The reality of life is it's a great species to manage, gives you tremendous room for error, tremendous fecundity, tremendous survival, especially when you take all the species collectively. One does well, the others don't do so well, and vice versa. So you've got kind of a portfolio of investments. But they are resilient, but they're not without limits. Let's look at the decline across the area that we're talking about over the last 150 years. And when you do these, I use a 30-year period because year-to-year variation, or even 5-year variation is too great. There's a lot of noise year to year if nothing else is being done. There's just a lot of noise in the runs. So use a 30-year average. And when you do that, the original numbers you have to back calculate from catch rates. In other words, people harvested, and you can estimate the number that the percentage of the run that they actually harvested and get a ballpark figure of how many fish were there. Not precise, but it gives you an idea. Let's look at Alaska, the first 30 years of harvest versus the last 30 years of harvest. The vertical axis here is the percent of historical run, and Alaska is actually about at the historical run. Now, that's not to say there aren't plenty of places with problems, okay? These are wild fish only. You've got, definitely there's issues, no question about it, but on the average, the aggregate average, it's roughly the same as the runs in the first 30 years. Let's look at BC. About a third of historical runs, 30-year averages. And that is very great range. Northern BC proportionally has done much better in terms of maintaining historical runs than southern BC, largely the Fraser River and Vancouver Island. But they're on the average down a third, down 2/3. The lower 48, about less than 5% of the historical numbers, okay, 30-year averages. 30-year averages, it gives you enough change in ocean cycles to dampen that influence out on the average. Well, what was the assumption you'd make? Well, it's obvious, it's what? Dams, right? Yeah, dams, okay? You look at the numbers across the lower 48, which is those 4 states, historically numbers were 40 to 50 million fish, roughly speaking. It's not in the billions, it's not in the tens of thousands, 40 to 50. Keep in mind, historical runs in all the lower 48 were roughly the size of what Bristol Bay will produce in a good season. So you don't, the comparison of absolute numbers of runs is pretty great historically, okay? But 40 to 50 million fish is nothing to sneeze at. Let's look at the different places. Columbia, lots of dams, right? So that'd be the worst hit, right? Puget Sound, lots of people, lots of changes, lots of dams, equally bad hit, right? Washington Coast, pretty clear, looks great, should be okay. I mean, very few dams on the Washington Coast. Oregon Coast, same deal, very few dams, pretty natural, most of it's a national forest and things like that. California is really 2 parts, the North Coast, or the coast in general, and the Central Valley. The Central Valley you'd think could be wiped out, but the coast is probably okay. Let's look. Historical runs, current runs. Columbia Basin, historical runs 10 to 15 million fish, current runs of wild fish, a couple 100,000. Now, 80% of the run in the Columbia is hatcheries, so when I say it's a couple 100,000 wild fish, that means it'd be 100,000 total. Puget Sound, historical runs, all the rivers, 20 million roughly, current runs, couple million, mostly in the north part of Puget Sound, Skagit River up around that area, just below the border. Washington Coast, fairly pristine habitat, historical runs, 2 or 3 or 4 million fish, current runs, a few 100,000. Oregon Coast, same deal, 4 or 5 million fish historically, current runs, a few 100,000 wild fish. California, historically 5 to 8 million, both Central Valley and the coast, current runs, a few 100,000, maybe even less. Let's look at that schematically. On the vertical axis, the overall run size approximately, this is very, smoothed out to give you a schematic of what happened. But let's say 1848 was 100%, that's historical run size on the average. Current run 2012. And we see this big oscillation, and of course we all know that's ocean conditions, and it's not as smooth as this because there's a lot of individual noise in there, but there's a general pattern of longward downward trend, and then periods of relatively good and relatively bad. And right now, the overall run size, wild fish, is less than 5%. Now here's a question, if you could go back and pick your career, where would you like to work as a fisheries biologist? Imagine you were working in this 30-year period, okay, whatever these years are, and that's the overall trajectory. People would say, you're the most incompetent manager. How could you, you're just, whatever you're doing is terrible. Look at this, we're going to be extinct here in a few years. Or, lucky you, You had this 30-year period. You can say, hey, brilliant, we finally got some decent people in here managing this fishery. So you have to subtract off where in this curve you are for these 30-year periods before you can tease out that from how things are actually going. The recovery efforts in the lower 48 have been massive and widespread, at least from a money standpoint. Now, you could argue that you ought to spend more money, but I mean, there's no question there are multiple billions, as in B, the most expensive recovery program in the United States, more expensive than the Everglades, more expensive than Chesapeake. It is billions of dollars, and that's really counting in part. You've got to add in how you cause social dislocation. In other words, people were doing something and they can't do it now because of salmon issues. But the fact is, the longward trend is downward. We have good years, no question about that. There's always years people, oh, the last 5 years have been great, but the long-term trends have been downward. It's very difficult to get looking beyond a few years. Well, that was the past. Good or bad, that's what happened. If you want to read more about it, you can go to my website and read more than you ever thought about reading about this topic, but it's not a complicated past, really.
This is KSKA Anchorage, and you're listening to Addressing Alaskans with Dr. Robert Lackey, Professor of Fisheries Science at Oregon State University. Straight Talk About the Future of Salmon was the title of his keynote address recorded at the Mat-Su Salmon Science and Conservation Symposium in Wasilla on November 7th.
Let's talk about the future. The most likely status, not necessarily the best status, the most desirable status, depending on where you stand politically, it's good or bad, but the most likely one. Given current trajectories, where are things likely to go? What will determine the future of wild salmon in Western North America? Okay, that's a kind of a philosophical point. One of the things that people will constantly say is, well, you shouldn't even try to forecast the future, because really you don't know a lot about things and things could change dramatically. I've always maintained in some sense it's almost easier to forecast next year or even 5 years than it is 2100. It's easier to do 2100 than it is next 1 to 5 years. Because in 2100, a lot of these variations get dampened out. When you're talking here these short-term forecasts a few years, the variations can be tremendous with nothing else you do managerially. There's a lot of known unknowns you can attach a rough probability to, and then there's unknown unknowns, where you don't have a clue what the issue is, much less how you attach probability to it. And so it's very easy to give up. Just say, I can't do it, there's no way you can credibly forecast, so let's move on to the next topic. Let's talk about the gravel size that coho salmon need in a certain stream. Let's look at one of those known unknowns, and that's changing climate. This has really nothing to do specifically with the influence of human activities here. We're just talking about climate. We talked a little bit about the glaciers and so forth, but let's look at the last 2,000 years of reconstructed climate. And right across the center horizontally is 0. That's basically the long-term 2,000-year average of the temperature. And deviations above, 2/10 above or 2/10 below, those seem like minor deviations, but you can see over a 2,000-year period, they can be very large and very significant. And let's start going back to 0, birth of Christ. The temperature there for the next 600 years, nothing to do with anything human actions, but the temperature there were below average, and we had the so-called dark ages. Now you can argue the point, how much did worldwide climate have an effect on the dark ages? That's open to debate, but it certainly was a cool period. Temperatures on the average, and they're highly variable as you can see, were below average, okay? And what did that mean for salmon? Not entirely clear, but it clearly was a big worldwide effect. Around 600-700 or so, climate warmed up, and this is what climatologists will call a medieval warming period, and it was relatively warm for the next 600 or 700 years. This was the time of major human expansion. A lot of people explored. The Vikings and so forth got to North America, Iceland, Greenland, and established colonies, and things were, from a human perspective, relatively good climate. Crops did well. It was just basically, from a human perspective, good time. Now, whether it's good or bad for salmon is another question, but it was good times for humans. So you had about 600-700 years there that were good times. Temperatures cooled off over a period of time, and we went into the Little Ice Age. and that's referred to as a little ice age because it's not as big as the real ice age, which is multiple tens of thousands of years, and it was not that cold by historical standards, but it was cool. If you go back and look at the artwork of the time, the paintings, you'll have people, paintings of people skating on ponds and rivers that haven't frozen since. Very, very cold time. And then the last 150, 200 years, it's clearly been warming. Now, this has nothing to do, human actions may well increase this, or I guess plausibly decrease it, but nonetheless, you should expect, as you forecast the future, a similar pattern to continue. There's no reason to assume that all of a sudden climate's going to go flat and stay constant. That's not going to happen. It is definitely warmer than it was in the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age was very cold, and it's much warmer now, and it's likely to be much warmer for the foreseeable future. Now, how might this affect salmon? Well, let's go back to the year 800, roughly speaking. These aren't all that precise. And we have the mother of all droughts. Southeastern United States, particularly in California, where the best data are, there was about a 200-year period of incredibly low rainfall and snowpack. I mean, not by any standards we've known for the last several hundred years, but I mean, it was like zip, very low. And you had a massive drought such that you'd look down in lakes, 200 feet in lakes, and see the remains of standing forest that established on dried land. That's how low, that's how much of a drought it was. Now you can imagine, I mean, on the surface you'd think that wouldn't be good for salmon. But you don't really know that. But nonetheless, those are the kinds of climatic changes that could take place. What does this mean for salmon? Let's look at a 2,200-year reconstruction of a salmon run. Actually, it's in Alaska. And if you look at this, you'll see that the run size varied a lot. I mean, the highest runs were back 200 years BC and up just before current times, but they varied a lot. And it doesn't really, these circles here represent the climatic conditions, the medieval warming and so forth, but they don't really correlate that well with the climatic conditions. But it's clear to say that runs vary a lot over a long-term time frame in the absence of human action. Human action can be important, but the runs also change naturally. Ocean conditions, ocean temperatures, Pacific decadal oscillations, El Niños, La Niñas, these things can affect runs. Now, this is the last 100 years, and if you look at it, year-to-year variation is tremendous. So we like to use these smoothing functions, the solid line, and when you look at the solid line, it looks pretty, stable. But if you look at year-to-year data, there's tremendous variation. This is another thing. These short-term fluctuations have to be factored into forecasts, or at least recognized. And the big uncertainties are economic factors. The bricks, the pigs. This will probably do more to establish the future of worldwide salmon than any other things we've talked about, any of the known things we've talked about. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China. If those economies boom, continue to boom, the drive for natural resources will consume a lot of salmon habitat. The pigs, depending on what happened to the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, Spain, if they go belly up, that could change. Who knows how that could affect it, but it will likely have a big effect on salmon. As one of my colleagues in Russia said, what defines the future of salmon in the Russian Far East is not what we do about poaching, it's not what we do about hatcheries, it's not what we do about regulation, but what will define the future of salmon in the Russian Far East is the price of copper, and using copper as a surrogate for all the industrial metals. If the price of copper stays high, this area Kamchatka will be developed. If worldwide copper and industrial commodities prices collapse, it won't be developed. So that'll be the driving factor. So whatever guess you put on your forecast relative to the price of copper will be a major driver in the future of salmon. And dramatic value shifts. People say, look for the future, see what's happening in California. In California, people don't fish anymore. In California, people don't hunt anymore. Sure, you're the sportsman's group, they're out there, there's a few guys like me that still hunt and fish. But basically, they don't do that anymore. That's a different world, okay? There's a world there that the values have shifted and are shifting dramatically. Not to say it's good or bad, but that's likely to be, if that's true, if California really is a precursor to the rest of the country, that's probably the direction. So, and the other point about this is watch out for the black swans. Now, this old cliche that we all use, you all know the story. I don't even know if the story is true, urban legend or not, but anyway, swan populations apparently in this area, one area, are always white. Hundreds of generations of white swans. But every century or so, a black one pops up. No one knows its genetics, no one has any clue why it is, but just all of a sudden a black swan appears in the flock. Why is that? And that's the same in forecasting. Watch out for the black swans, things that you just absolutely could not predict. If you could predict them, they would be unknown knowns, which are often called gray swans. But black swans, you have no clue. Okay, that's theoretical. We could give up and go home and not forecast. Let's not do that. It'd be a short talk otherwise. Let's focus on the core policy drivers, the things that in policy we actually do control, we do influence, and if you didn't like the current trajectory, you could change those policy drivers and come up with a different direction. And I argue that there are 4 of these. These are the crucial ones. First is, and this policy driver, if you want a long-term future of wild salmon, will have to change. Not necessarily here being Alaska at large, but worldwide it has to change. And that's the rules of commerce. Rules of commerce. And this rule is, the current rules of commerce tend to work against increasing the abundance of wild salmon, and especially problematic are trends in international commerce and market globalization. Now, this is not a pitch to change the rules. It just says these rules don't work in terms of increasing the numbers of wild salmon, and the long-term trajectory, unless this changes, is downward. What do I mean? Let's look at these rules of commerce and think about yourself. Our rules for commerce are defined by things like this: individual choice. You make choices, I make choices, and these choices collectively defines the type of commerce that we're going to have. No one holds a gun to our head. We go out and buy things or we don't buy things. We live in certain areas, we don't. These are personal choices, not central planning. Personal freedom trumps collective good. Now, political scientists will tell you there's such a thing as a collective good. The collective good is really just a collection of individual goods, okay? We value personal freedom. I can't tell you what to do, except for a fairly narrow set of human behaviors that the law addresses. So ultimately, people make individual choices. Nothing wrong with it, nothing right about it. Externalities. We put a lot of things outside the rules of commerce, and these are handled largely by other kinds of things like rules, laws, policies, and so forth. Salmon, generally speaking, are one of these. The consumer is king. You make choices by what you buy, or votes cast, okay? It's not like somebody holds a gun to your head and says, well, you can't buy a house, period. If you want to buy a house, you can buy a house if you got the money. Now, what about these market-driven economies like we have now worldwide? I mean, basically, the centrally planned economies have completely collapsed, and they were lousy at dealing with salmon anyway, but they've essentially collapsed. So in varying degrees, we have largely market-driven economies now. You can argue that Western Europe is still rough, somewhat centrally planned, and Russia and China maybe are too, but they at least have a modicum of market-driven characteristics. Now, let's look at an average family in North America, US and Canada. Somebody calculated the average, I think it was median family, and they got somebody who's supposed to have the statistically average or median amount of natural or commodities and so forth. They live in a house. The median family is, this structure. They've got 1.5 dogs and 1.3 cats. In the background, you'll see 2 vehicles. You'll see all kinds of furniture, refrigerators, and all kinds of amenities. If you went inside the house there, you'd probably see a lot of stuff they didn't bring out. By historical standards, the median is a wealthy family, at least historically. These choices have a direct relationship with salmon. I'm not saying these are bad choices and market-driven economies, this rule 1, has created tremendous wealth. Well, let's look at the choices that we make, this family makes, and how it affects salmon. They leave there after this photograph is taken because somebody took all their furniture out and somebody's got to put it back in. So meanwhile, they're going, what are they going to do? Let's go down and get something to eat. Our stove is taken out, our refrigerator is taken out, let's go to McDonald's. And you go to McDonald's, what do? What do you do when you go to McDonald's? Yeah. You purchase food, and in particular, you get French fries. The clue was the photograph, okay? You're not never going to make it in class, you know. When the professor says, you know, what is it, and there's a photograph, that's a clue. Anyway, you get French fries, you buy potatoes, you are making a choice about salmon. You are making the kind of choice that defines the future of salmon when you buy French fries at McDonald's or any place else you want to buy them at. Because, to use this very simplistic example, this is another lesson in agronomy or agriculture, they come from potatoes. In the lower 48, potatoes come from irrigated agriculture. Now, I know a fair number of farmers, none of them which really grow potatoes, but I'll guarantee you none of those farmers are against salmon. All of them would love to have a salmon run in the stream that runs near their property, but they also want to produce potatoes, and they've got to compete. McDonald's has very high standards for their potatoes, but they've got to keep the costs down. So every one of these farmers is making individual choices, irrigation and so forth. And every one of them is taking water out of the stream. And in these areas, they're taking water out of the stream that supports salmon runs. You are making a choice then about salmon. Not a good or bad choice, you're making a choice. Are there better alternatives? There's no obvious better alternatives from a salmon perspective. The central plant economies have mostly collapsed, and they were lousier on salmon than the Western economies, the market-driven economies are. So it's not clear to me what the alternative rules are, but I'm just saying the current rules are driving long-term salmon downward. Talk about rule number 2 that would have to be changed. Scarce natural resources. Now, we could use energy, or we could use water, we could use lots of copper, we could do lots of things. I'm going to stick with water because for salmon, obviously, this is a biology lesson, and to live, salmon need water. You got it, okay. However, the demand for this all critical natural resources, but particularly for water, will increase through this century. What a shock. Let's look at that. This competition, increasing demand, is going to continue. What's this going to mean for salmon? Conflict. Here an example. I would have actually had a photograph here of people protesting with Obama sign just to make it politically balanced, but couldn't find one, so I have Clinton's policies on one side and Bush's policies on the other side, and people protesting about this is a terrible situation, and you know, this guy's going to ruin our farms, et cetera, or this guy's going to ruin our salmon, et cetera. Conflict. And what happens in conflict politically? Well, at the end of the day, what do you usually end up doing? You compromise. Another biology lesson. Compromise for a salmon is a loss. Salmon cannot compromise. If we outlaw wood, you could plausibly build your house out of plastic or steel or aluminum. If we outlawed concrete, you could do asphalt or something else. You have choices, okay? There's substitution. You can't substitute liquid ammonia here. You got to have water of a certain quality at the right time of year. And so every compromise ultimately is less desirable from the salmon run perspective. Now, I realize that people don't say, I'm out to eradicate salmon. There's something else good that they want from that use of that water. But the fact is, a compromise is a lose from a salmon perspective. Let's get close to home and uncomfortable. Let's talk about the lower 48 human population in the region. This core policy driver that would have to change says the number of humans in this region, in this case California through BC as well as Idaho, will increase, and their aggregate demands to support their chosen lifestyle will constrain the abundance of wild salmon. Okay? Let's go back and look at the worldwide distribution of salmon. In this map, The dark brown is, the brown is the density of humans, the darkest brown is the highest density. You can see China, India, Western Europe has the highest density. Let's overlay historical distribution of salmon. Let's do another history lesson. Asian Far East. As the population of China rose, last 700 or 800 years particularly, the number of salmon declined almost to zero. Same with Korea, same with Japan. So pattern, human population goes up, salmon goes down. North of that, in the Russian Far East, the population is very low. Salmon runs are still very high, or similar to historical numbers. Let's look at Europe. Through the warming times, Middle Ages, populations grew rapidly, development grew rapidly, and as the human population in continental Europe increased, salmon runs declined. And the northern half of the distribution, Norway and northward and around, those populations are still relatively low and the salmon runs are still relatively high. They're down from historical, but they're still fairly high. Eastern North America. As the US developed in the Northeast, salmon runs declined and even disappeared. So the pattern is the same. Human populations increase, salmon runs go down. Let's look at our part of the world. Demographers refer to Western North America as flyover country because except for a few cities, you know, LA particularly, you fly over it. It's fill-in country. There's not, by worldwide standards, there's not much population there. This is likely to change. Let's look at the projected forecast, especially for the lower 48. Let's start with California. Currently, 40 million people. Historically, it started with essentially zero, I mean a very low number, hundreds of thousands. The Aboriginal population was wiped out diseases long before the miners got there. There were certainly some residual human populations, but they were very low by historic. The highest populations in the lower 48 in this part of the world was probably around 1,500. At 1,500, it dropped tremendously due to all the introduced diseases. So by 1850, it were very, very, very low human populations. And it's increased dramatically. And so we have right now roughly 40 million people. By the end of this century, we can expect California not to have 40 million people. We can expect it to have perhaps 160 million people. That's European population densities. Now, some people say, no, the population is slowing down. It's only going to be 100 million. Okay, fine, let's give you 100 million. So 40 to 100 million. We're talking about a doubling by the mid-century. So, you know, you're already at mid-century, you're already going to be at 80 million. Well, let's look at the Pacific Northwest. And for this exercise, I'm going to drop off Montana here and just include Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia, 3 states, 1 province. Go back to 1850, essentially uninhabited, very low population densities. Certainly not zero, but low. It increased a lot to 1900. 3 states, 1 province. By 1900 was up to about 1 million. By 1950, it increased to maybe 4 or 5 million. Now it's up to 15 million people. 3 states, 1 province, 15. And what do you think 2100 will be? 15 now. By 2100, you should be an operating forecast for about 100 million people. Now the forecast, a lot of the population bureaus use, it'll slow way down, the growth rate will slow way down, but as people are leaving California like mad, I fail to see that myself, but nonetheless, they only forecast a population of 65 million people. 15 now, 65 at the end of this century. A lot of people, but these are abstractions. Let's talk about specifics. Let's jump ahead to the landscape of the Pacific Northwest in 2100. How many people have been to Oregon? Oh, almost everybody. Okay, good. Imagine driving up the Willamette Valley and starting in Eugene. Okay? Eugene in 2100 will be the southern end of the city of Port Jean. Port Jean will be created by the growing together through this century of the current standalone cities of Eugene, Corvallis, Albany, Salem, Portland, Vancouver, Washington, and Port Jean in 2100 will not be its current population of about 1.5 million. It'll be 6 million people. City of Port Jean. But Port Jean will have an inferiority complex because just north of it will be the city of Sevan. And Sevan will be formed through this century, as we see it now happening, of the growing together of the currently independent cities of Olympia, Tacoma, Seattle, Bellingham, Vancouver, BC, extending out the Fraser Valley to Hope, and going across Vancouver Island up as far as perhaps Nanaimo. Sevan in 2100 will be a city of 30 million people, roughly the size of present-day Mexico City or Tokyo. Now that is the environment that you're forecasting the future of salmon on. Well, how likely? You can say, oh, these population numbers are not going to happen. People are going to look at these population growth and they're going to say, this is not a situation we want to go to. We're going to have to do something about it. Not clear what's going to be done. But nonetheless, so you say, well, how likely are people to change policy? Where are you likely to see the precursor of policy change? Probably in some of the big environmental advocacy groups, okay? They're most likely to be arguing for policy changes on the front end, and then eventually the public at large might go along with it. What do the big environmental advocacy groups say? They don't say squat. And I'm not saying they should say it, but they don't. So there's really no indication. When they do say something, they give me the clue that I don't see any major change in policy. And let's look at the Sierra Club as an example. The largest in membership, at least, and probably the wealthiest or close to the wealthiest. Their policy currently is essentially none. No, I'm not saying they should have a policy. I'm just saying that that's likely to where the first inkling of is going to be a change in policy to come from, and it doesn't. Therefore, I don't think this core policy driver is likely to change. Let's look at individual priorities. That was the kind of the collective numbers of people. Let's look at individual choices and forecast out. And I would argue that this core policy driver has to change if the long-term downward trajectory in the lower 48 is going to be reversed. And that's individual and collective preferences, our choices, directly determine the future of wild salmon. There is a one-to-one relationship. And substantial and pervasive changes must take place in these preferences if this downward trend is to be reversed. And these changes are not of the scope of recycle your newspaper or get an insulated coffee cup. We're talking here about major changes, not minor tweaks. Well, the question then you have to say is, how likely are people to change? You know, we could say, well, you know, I'm not saying these changes ought to be done, but I'm saying if they're not, the trajectory is clear. How likely? Well, let's look at some examples, or at least one example, where people had a clear-cut choice. Because usually when you go out and get fries, you don't say, I'm making a choice about salmon. You know, most people, in fact, nobody thinks about that except for me, okay? But that is a choice. But now, what if people have choices? If you ask people, what would you do for salmon? They'll say a lot. I'll pay more money on my electric bill, I'll do whatever. But let's look when they actually have a choice. And let's use what political scientists love because it's a clear-cut choice of where people are at. Bonneville Power Administration basically, in essence, manages and markets the power coming to the Columbia hydro system. And if you go back to 2001, there was a series of brownouts and blackouts in California. They couldn't buy power at any price. They basically had a grid that was functionally inoperative. They just couldn't get power. You can argue what the reasons were, but the fact is clear-cut. The only place you could buy power in quantities that they needed was from the hydro system, actually of Bonneville, as well as BC Hydro. But Bonneville had water stored behind the dams, some of those dams, for salmon migration, to save that water for key times to let it out to get salmon downstream or upstream. And so it's a very clear-cut choice. California having a serious power shortage, very serious power shortage, people not having air conditioners is a serious summer, this was air conditioning, serious power shortage, or water stored for salmon. Clear-cut choice. I mean, scientists never agree on the facts. You could say it's a sky blue, and there will be arguments about what type of blue it was and all the rest of it. It's not going to happen here. Clear-cut, water for salmon, California needs power. What was the choice? Well, did anybody here argue that it was going to be made in favor of salmon? Oh, good, an audience of realists. Well, you're right. The decision was made. The dams were run 24/7 for 3 weeks, and the power was sold to California. Here's the take-home message. All the environmental advocacy groups essentially sat on their hands and whined about it minimally, but hey, it's reality. No one really protested. Everybody knew the facts. Most people said it was a terrible choice, but not much of a choice. Had to do it. That's a take-home message to me. That would have to change. Because those power failures like that, and the equivalent versions of them, are going to continue through this century. And so when those choices are made, you're making a choice about salmon. They're rarely explicit, like that one is, but they're made all the time. I want to hasten to add, I'm not saying that was a bad choice. I'm a dog lover. And if I lived in Southern California, I'd probably want a similar situation for my dog, okay? I'm not saying that's less important than these, whatever these are over here. But that's a choice that would have to be different if the long-term downward trajectory is going to be changed. So let me summarize this part. I'm assuming, you can come up with your own choice, that these rules of commerce are not going to change greatly. They will change. We'll whine about China and free trade and so forth, but ultimately it won't change dramatically. Scarce natural resources, no one's going to come up with a substitute for water. Okay, energy won't go away. It'll become more expensive, more difficult to get, but it'll still be there. And no one's going to come up probably for a cheap substitute for copper and these other natural resources. And I'm also saying, and you plug in your own view, that our individual and collective priorities are not likely to change dramatically. We all have 401ks and equivalent. At the end of the day, we want those to do well. And if that involves investing in industries that use copper, we will. So given that, then the most likely forecast for the future of wild salmon in the lower 48 is that wild salmon will be reduced to remnant runs in these 3 states and 4 states in southern BC. They won't disappear. They won't go extinct. There'll still be remnant runs there. They probably won't be, except in the rarest case, sufficient to fish, but they'll still be there. It's almost impossible to drive salmon completely to extinction. There's usually remnant runs, and of course fishermen stop fishing long before they become remnant, unless they're subsidized. So the 21 forecast, if you want more about it, you go to my website or the books here, and we don't make any money on a book. It's strictly a nonprofit thing, so we're not pitching. I guess we are pitching it, but we're not pitching it for monetary reasons. But that's the forecast, the most likely future. Are there alternatives? And that moves to the third part of the talk, and that is what alternative policies would restore salmon? Now at this stage, you're probably saying to yourself, oh my God, it's hopeless, forget it, it's not going to happen. Given the current reality that he's outlining here, if I accept it, and it doesn't sound very good, but I can't think of really the alternative. Are there policy options or policy prescriptions that would alter this scenario in the lower 48? And I would argue that there are. We're on a trajectory. I think the trajectory is clear-cut over the long term. Short term is not so clear because there's ups and downs and everything else, but the long term it's clear. There are policy prescriptions that would change that. And some of those are practical. They're practical in the sense that if society does make these changes, they could restore salmon. And that leads to the Salmon 2100 project. Now this project was really 33 people. We originally invited 28 people. And these people were long-term. If you didn't have gray hair, we didn't want you. You had to be either at the end of your career or far in your career, preferably done with your career. You were past the stage that your agency or your organization would basically pitch you out and you'd be unhappy about it. You had to have enough seniority experience that people said, well, you just basically don't have enough experience to be credible. And these were all scientists, some managers, some advocates, some political types, some basically science types, and they covered all the way from BC to California. We had about 6 or 8 in each state, province. They did this all as volunteers. No one got a dime for this. They wrote these chapters in this book, which I'll talk about, all gratis. They did almost all of them on their own time. They do not speak for their agencies or their organizations, and some of them took tremendous heat. We started off with 27 actually, 27. 4 dropped out. Interestingly enough, 2 of the 4 dropped out because they went into emotional breakdowns. And they went into emotional breakdowns because they had spent their careers trying to restore salmon. They were political types, advocates, and they couldn't come up with a scenario they thought passed the laugh test. And that was such a jolt career-wise that they just basically couldn't continue. And two others had to withdraw because their agency said, if you don't come out with our favorite policy prescription, you're out of here. So anyway, it was in a lot of respects kind of a sobering exercise in its own right, and I'll talk more this afternoon about some of the specific feedback, but this was about the overall design. We started with these, ended up with 23. Some of them added co-authors, and so that's why we ended up with 33, the larger number. But we started with 23 actually wrote chapters. The question they were asked, and you ought to think how you would answer this question, what specific policies would have to be implemented in order to have high probability, you can't rely on divine intervention here, of restoring significant runs, and significant we defined as fishable runs, and fishable we defined as roughly 1/3 of historic, 1/3 or more of historic. And so just meeting ESA requirements was not sufficient. ESA requirements don't allow fishing. So you could be successful in ESA requirements, Endangered Species Act requirements, and not have any fishing at all. Through 2100, which is long enough to go through multiple ocean cycles, and California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and southern BC. That's the question. They came up with 23 independently developed policy prescriptions that each author or set of authors agreed if these were implemented, they would work. Now, these were developed independently. This was not a collective effort. And the reason was because the people that were doing it, a lot of them couldn't stand the others. We had people across kind of the political spectrum. Some people kind of tended towards hatcheries, tended towards wild fish, tended towards back to the Pleistocene, you know, hey, get real. And so they covered a lot of gamut, and a lot of them basically said, I don't even want to deal with X. You know, he's a dinosaur. And other people said, you know, he's a left-wing wacko. I don't want to deal with him. So they developed them independently, and there was a lot of overlap, as you'd predict. A lot of them looked pretty similar. So we combined them into general groups. Here's the first group, 6 policy prescriptions, and they're permutations of this same idea. I could paraphrase these authors, and they wouldn't use these words, but I could paraphrase what they said as something like this. If you want to bring back wild salmon in the lower 48, you got to get real. Get a grip on reality and use what tools are available. You know, we have power tools now. No one builds a house with a hammer and a handsaw. Get real. It's not going to work. And they would argue the case, wild salmon, give me a break. In the lower 48, we put out hatcheries. We've been doing hatcheries for 140 years. We've dumped these wild fish. We've dumped hatchery fish every place. There's no such thing as wild. I mean, these fish, these genes have been spread over everything, and now these things in these pristine streams, you know, you can go back on the records and find Bureau of Commercial Fisheries dumped fish in there just by the truckload. Who knows where they came from? Probably from 2 hatcheries. Examples of what they would use in terms of their policy prescriptions tended to be the following. You're going to use hatcheries. Get looser, more realistic on a definition of wild, and supplementally stock. Use what you know about genetics now to create fish that do well in the natural world. There's a good track record there. You're going to have to create some basic artificial spawning habitats like people in British Columbia and elsewhere have done, in the lower left. This can be done. You know the gravel size, you know the water flows, you know all this kind of jazz. You can do it. Go back if it's a serious restoration efforts. Don't worry about aesthetics. You know, salmon spawning streams stink. EPA ought to shut them down. That's a reality of life. You're going to have to create those in places where they'll work. I would define these folks essentially as get a life, get real, do it. Those prescriptions, other people couldn't stand those prescriptions. That was not even acceptable. The second class of prescriptions would be triage, and no one uses triage. That's our term. Triage people said, focus recovery efforts in areas that have the best chance of success. Why are you putting all your money in a place where you're dealing with 6 fish, each of which has a first name? You know, this is not a good thing to do. My theory of recovery is when you give names to returning fish, the game is over. You need to work strategically. And what does strategically mean? Well, strategically means focus your efforts in areas where the habitat is good, or at least reasonably good. You can do something with it. Don't focus on the industrial rivers of the San Joaquin, Sacramento, the Klamath, the Columbia. You know, these areas are industrial. I mean, they're growing food and other kinds of things and people. Your chance of success here for wild fish are someplace between 0 and none. Focus your money in places like the upper left. And in the lower left, you have the great Puget Sound. Let me tell you, this is a salmon biology lesson. This is not a great place to restore salmon. You know, I mean, it's just not. Your potential here, you might get a few remnant fish back, but it's just not, for serious salmon, it's not a great place. So focus your resources on the upper left, the areas that have the best possibility of recovery. There's a problem here, though. ESA, Endangered Species Act, does not allow you to triage. As soon as any agency proposed this, they would be in a lawsuit to saying you're giving up on a listed species, either endangered or threatened. So there's some serious legal issues here, policy issues that would have to be addressed. But these are the triage policy prescriptions. The third one, as a former bureaucrat, near and dear to my heart, is there are really few bureaucratic incentives to protect, restore, and enhance wild salmon runs. In fact, you could argue there's really incentives not to do it. And these people would argue we got to get out of symbolic politics. And symbolic politics are you convey to people, the public, the image that you're doing something. We're working hard, we're doing lots of things, and we never said this, but the implication is it's going to work, okay? Now, here's the deal. If you go to an agency like National Marine Fisheries Service, a lot of my colleagues work there, is all they're required to do is come up with a plan to address ESA requirements. And if they don't, they could be, in theory, no one's ever fired in the government, but they could be fired. They will not be fired if they don't recover wild salmon. There's really no performance measure that you're actually recovering salmon. The performance measure is your plan in place? So plans become the measure of success, not fish. How could it be changed? These people would argue, in these prescriptions, somehow, and it was never completely clear to me, frankly, how we can get past the avoiding symbolic politics, other than the fact outside groups or somebody has to challenge people when they say it, and say, you know, we're spending billions of dollars to recover salmon in the Columbia, and for wild salmon, that possibility in Idaho, for example, is someplace between 0 and none, but we never said that, but that's what people hear. And we also have the agencies, my former agencies, basically working hard, massively large budgets, and not recovering salmon. Some would argue we need to go through a legal system. Basically, courts ought to mandate it, and we've been in the lower 48 tied up in court forever. Agencies have just consumed themselves in defending themselves in lawsuits. And I'm not sure that's been all that fruitful, except it's generated a lot of money for lawyers. And the other side of that coin is, let's be frank here, I'm in this class too, those of us who are fisheries biologists. These are great times for fisheries biologists because we've never had so much money in the lower 48 in fisheries as long as these lawsuits and all these other kinds of things go on. So a cynic, and my colleagues in political science will say this, fisheries biologists don't, they'll say, well, you guys are just self-serving. You complain about the lawyers all the time fattening up under the ESA. Biologists have fattened up more than lawyers. Fourth policy prescription, class of policy prescription, force change, behavioral change through incentives and punishment. You know, this is in vogue now, you know, give people the incentives, focus on human choices and give people the incentive to change, or a stick, you know, a carrot or the stick, which is basically the law. So let's look at what they might do. They might say, use IRS. IRS only incidentally collects money to run the government. It basically is trying to change behavior on lots of different areas. Other people would argue, no, get the prices right. If you had to pay the full cost of electricity, when you buy that tomato in winter, if you had to pay the full cost of that tomato in winter in terms of its loss to salmon, you might not buy that tomato. If you had to look at the salmon cost and the French fries at McDonald's in the lower 48, you may not buy those French fries. And then again, you may say, forget it, it's just cost doing business. Or the law. You could change the law and mandate. You know, we talk a lot about a salmon czar. I don't think it's going to happen because czars don't have the authority to change behavior in the way that some of these advocates would want. And the one that's a real bugaboo here in the lower 48 is this human population trajectory. You know, it's pretty clear. I don't think there's any argument. More people, less salmon, okay? And so if you accept more people, it's not clear to me. Tell me again how it's not going to be anything but less salmon. So if people aren't willing to address that, and I'm not saying they should, but they ought to recognize the consequence. Let me wrap up with a question that's crucial in the lower 48 about the project. Should society adopt a policy prescription that would recover wild salmon? That's a question we did not address. We laid out 23 prescriptions that would recover wild salmon in our view, but we recognize those trade-offs are against other things that people want to, and ultimately that's a societal choice. There are alternative futures that would work in the lower 48. They're in this book. It's available from American Fisheries Society for $55. Maybe we could pass that around here, and if you're interested, we don't get a dime, as I mentioned, but it does give all the specifics. I recognize that charting a preferred course here, or the lower 48, is in fact what political scientists would call a wicked, messy policy problem. It's a problem that none of the choices are very pleasant. Politicians would call it a thorny issue. And it's a thorny issue from a political standpoint because, generally speaking, there's no way they're going to come out ahead of the game on it. They're going to lose votes no matter which way they go. So it is a difficult issue, no question about that. On the other side, I'll leave you with several messages. The first is, the history of the declines is well documented. There's no surprises here. We know what's happened. We've got other places on the planet where the same scenario took place, exactly the same situation. The details differ, but it's the same basic situation. It's a group of fishes that we have studied more than any other group of fishes in the world. We know more about salmon than any other group of fish in the world. So we can say we always need more science, but we know more about this group than any other group scientifically. Don't hide behind the fact we need more science. I mean, I'm a scientist. We write articles, and in a very article we say more research needs to be done. Short-term focus tends to push out long-term focus. This is the classic thing, is the urgent always pushes out the important. We run after the immediate crisis, whatever happens this year or the last 5 years, and the long-term trajectory gets lost. And finally, watch out for symbolic politics. Activity does not mean success in salmon recovery.
This is KSKA Anchorage, and you've been listening to Addressing Alaskans with Dr. Robert Lackey, Professor of Fisheries Science at Oregon State University. Dr. Lackey's keynote address on Straight Talk about the future of salmon at this year's Mat-Su Salmon Science and Conservation Symposium was recorded in Wasilla on November 7th, 2012.